Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to this postmortem of my Blitz game number 877. My opponent started off with e4 and I went with e5, just playing classically with the pawn in the center. And then instead of playing the usual moves here, knight f3, knight c3, let's see, he went with d4, which is known as the center game at this point. And after I take, which is the main response, that e-pawn is undefended and you get kind of a passive position if you just defend it. So you take. If he takes back with the queen, that's the center game. And that's playable for white, but it doesn't seem to lead to much of an advantage. After the queen takes, and chase the queen with c6, and then queen e3 is a way to get some kind of edge here, maybe pushing these center pawns forward to cramp black's position. But basically, black is doing okay here. Normally when someone plays the center game, he's actually got something different in mind, going with some kind of gambit. You can also throw in this knight f3 move here before going for a gambit move like c3, and that leads to interesting gambit play as well. So c3, this is probably heading for the Danish gambit. That's why I called this the Danish gambit declined. Also, that's how Leach has identified it. If you take the bishop to c4, that's what I've always known as the Danish gambit. If they take with the knight, I don't know, maybe that's a different variation of the Danish gambit. If they take with the knight, let's see, knight c6 and go knight f3. This gambit position I think is actually okay for white. I think white has some decent compensation for it, which is why I kind of avoid this line in the way I play. That's why it's I decline the gambit. Let's see, if we back up to this point, if you played knight f3 first, I think you would transpose into that same position, or could potentially if you wanted to as white. So c3, instead of taking, I just played d5. I guess the other line in the Danish gambit, the main line, it goes like this, bishop here, and then you can take or you can develop. If you just develop, once again, the knights will come out, and white has pretty decent play for the pawn. But if you keep taking, I think actually there are lines here, it looks really scary at first with those bishops looking at your king side. But there are lines here that that can kind of neutralize white's activity, and white starts out 2 pawns down. So just to show you an example, this is a line I used to play a lot. Knight f6. White pushes on with e5, you respond with d5, typical kind of answer. And then if he takes, you take. If he trades queens, at first it looks like he's just killing you here, but you have some tempo moves here. This bishop can come out with check, knight to c3, and then it looks like rook e8 is the book line here. I usually just went at this point, I'd usually just went rook g8 directly, but you can play rook e8 check first and then drop back to g8. Basically, you just need to stop that pawn from queening, and you are, let's see, it's 4 versus 2 over here and 4 versus 1 over here. So you're a pawn up at this point. You might even round up this pawn on g7, and so I think black is just a little better here, although looking at it with the most recent Stockfish 9, Stockfish says it's even. So probably, a computer could play that out to a draw from that position. But I think black has the better chances. White probably has to be pretty precise in how he plays to get enough activity to justify the loss of material there. So anyway, but I avoid that because of those lines with the knights. I think gives some pretty good play to white. So at this point, I just play the move d5 rather than taking on c3. And this is a well-known idea. Just kind of disrupting the gambit play by putting a pawn in the center. And then white usually takes, and then you take back, and then white can take again. And so there's no gambit now. It's just a materially equal position. White has a little more center influence because of the isolated queen's pawn here, but black's a bit ahead in development. And I think this is a decent position for black. So I wouldn't mind playing that. And then the way my opponent played it, I don't know if I've seen this before. He, instead of taking with the pawn, instead of playing e takes d5, he took with the queen. He played queen takes d4. And this actually is a gambit again. So he stays a pawn down. And trading queens. Once again, he could take here, and blocking with the bishop is apparently the most accurate way to play it. And there's one little trick. If he plays bishop g5, taking advantage of the pin, you probably don't want to play knight f6 right away, but you can throw on this move knight d7 to prepare knight to f6, and then you're okay. If you play knight f6 right away, then he can probably just take it and mess up your pawns over here on the king side. Might be a little uncomfortable. So that seems to be an okay position for black as well. Anyway, he took the queens off, and so for the moment at least, I'm a pawn up, and I guess this is where we leave the opening book. The normal move, well, the move preferred by the chess engine was bishop e4. The opening book has both bishop e4 and bishop e3 rather, and bishop c4 as potential moves here. He played bishop to f4, and the chess engine gives black an advantage, but not a whole pawn up. So this pawn is kind of far advanced and hard to hold on to. And I probably should have, especially if you believe the engine, I probably should have just played knight f6 and defended it with the knight and not tried what I was trying to do, this move f4. Well, first I did bishop d6. I guess this was okay. He decided to trade here. I'm just trying to neutralize his active pieces here. But he plays knight to d2, attacking my pawn. It's at this point where I played f5 to hold on to the pawn, and maybe I should have just played knight f6 and just developed with my pieces, because it seems like I can't hold on to that pawn anyway. Let's see. Instead of knight d2, actually the chess engine likes the move c4. Just guarantees that I can't push my d-pawn forward to support the e-pawn, and his knight can then come out to the c3 square, which is a bit more active. But anyway, he went knight d2. I went f5. And now he goes knight c4, hitting by d-pawn, so I move my king to e7, and he castles. At this point, there's just no way to hold on to it. So the extra pawn, I'm going to lose this pawn on d6. So the chess engine would just develop with the knight. Say knight to either one was about even, but say I looked at the example with knight c6, he takes, and then knight f6. So just get the two knights out. Don't worry about the bishop. So giving up the bishop pair if he wants, I guess. No, it's not the bishop pair. Giving up the bishop if he wants. I'll have two knights against knight and bishop. But I'll have a lot of activity here. So the material is even, but actually the chess engine gives the black a pretty good edge here based on better development, I suppose. The king in the center can be an advantage too. Something to keep an eye on. Anyway, I went with bishop to e6, so not quite as good. He took. And then I went with b6, and at this point, the chess engine changes its evaluation completely and thinks that white is better. So b6 is apparently a big mistake. Let's see. I was a little worried about him taking another pawn here, and then, I'm the one who has to look for compensation. But knight f6, knight takes b7, I can take on a2. And so this trade of the b pawn for the a pawn is viewed favorably by the chess engine, and I think I can see that. I think it weakens his side. It's the queen side, but over here where his king is, and gives the bishop some good squares to go to. So it seems like a decent way to play, and it's not going down a pawn the way I thought. So it didn't really need to play b6. Maybe that's the point. And here is how white could kind of seize the initiative and get an advantage after I play this one slow move, this b6 move. He could go g4 here, and taking looks pretty awful. If I take, he takes his center pawn, and then this file, the e file, is open towards my king. Don't really want that, so I would probably play g6 here. He takes, I take. Then he could play f3, further undermining things. Let's see, I go knight f6 to try and hold on to it, and then he goes bishop to h3. And things are just kind of falling apart here in the center. I mean, I can play rook to d8, and well, the game will continue, but it looks like he's going to round up these pawns over here and maybe even emerge a pawn up. So that's how white can kind of grab the initiative and get some kind of edge at this position. after I played b6. But instead he played b3. Well, this makes sense. It blunts my bishop, and the a-pawn is no longer hanging. So, but this leaves me with that slight edge that I've had since the opening. So I continue with my development. I get my knights out now. He goes bishop to b5. I get my knight to e5 since he's harassing it. And here he plays f4. And so at this point, I mean, we exchanged that one pair of mistakes, but basically we've stayed in the range of about even with a slight edge to black. But this is where things really shift. So this f4 move is a big mistake. I think maybe he was just expecting me to take on passant, but that would really help him. It would, give him some free development with that knight, and it would also open up these files towards my king. So, there's only actually one move for black here, and it's the move I found, knight to g4. But it's the move that gives black pretty much a winning edge, because we're almost in the end game, and now I've got this protected passed pawn. It's the pawn on e4 there, and that's a very dangerous thing for the endgame. So even though I'm not a pawn up, the chess engine is actually giving me a +2 edge here. So let's see, he develops his knight, he gets his pieces out, and he protects against the fork. He's got to deal with that. Play rook to d8. I was anxious to chase this knight away from this nasty square where it's kind of threatening my my pieces here. So he dropped back. That was reasonable, and then I developed my other knight. Goes rook h to e1. So we both get all our pieces out, although his knight is kind of sidelined. So that's probably where the other part of my advantage comes from. One part of it is from the passed pawn, and the other part is from his awkward piece there. Let's see. He went knight to d5 here. Oh, I went knight to d5 here. Yeah, I was looking at some ideas of doing stuff with the e3 square, maybe trying to push that pawn forward or park a knight there, although it's not possible at the moment. And then yeah, it wasn't particularly appreciated by the chess engine, although it still kept a winning edge for black. But it liked this move, which I thought was a nice idea. a6, bishop takes, and rook a8. After the bishop moves, I'm rounding up this a-pawn once again. So it seems like that a-pawn was like something that the chess engine has kept its eye on the a-pawn and is looking for ways to snag that. Probably disrupts white's pawn structure over here on the queen side around the king. Makes that a little more vulnerable to attack. So anyway, interesting play from the engine. I think I have to agree with it. That looks like a good move. Let's say knight d5, though, still okay. I mean, it is a threat here, attacking the c3 pawn, and king to b2 should be played. This not only defends the c3 pawn, it also defends the a pawn, takes away this idea of a6 and rook a8, and I'm still winning here, but it's still a game that has to be played. I still have to prove that I can win. And so this move, knight e5, is just making it easy for me. I'm going to trade that off, of course, and then I've got another pawn here that I can go after. And oh yeah, and I win the c pawn immediately. So oh yeah, this is all just bad for black. And yeah, so I just have like a winning edge here, and it doesn't dissipate this time. I keep it, and so just go through the rest of the moves. They're pretty straightforward. And at this point, he resigned. There's just no way to trap the knight. If he pushes this pawn forward, the knight's coming out to c3. Let's see. Yeah, there's just no way to trap that knight. So he resigned here, have a powerful edge. Even if he could win the knight, I might still win with the 4 pawns over here on the king side. Anyway, it was an interesting game. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you again soon. Bye.